So good evening, and I hope you've brought along your glass of wine or cup of tea as you join us for this very special Friends at Home event. We are delighted to welcome Avril Avignon. Okay. My name is Marcia Holm, and I am with the Friends of the Alameda Free Library here in Alameda. Before we get started, I want to review a couple of technical details. This is a live webinar and it is being recorded. The audio for us in the audience will be muted and the video is turned off so that you'll only see the speaker and Avril's presentation, as well as I'll be on camera for part of the time. We're going to ask that you use the chat feature to introduce yourself as well as to ask your questions. And we are monitoring the chat and ask that all participants act with respect in their comments. So before I turn it over to Avril, I want to tell you about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We, of course, are celebrating our 50th anniversary throughout 2024. A nonprofit organization, we raise money and we advocate for our outstanding public library in Alameda. Our Friends at Home events provide an opportunity to connect you and share common experiences. So thanks to our supporters for their ongoing donations so that we can continue to honor our commitments to the library and to support these Friends at Home events. We're going to ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable for you via our website at alamedafriends.com. We're also going to be putting a link into the chat feature. So now on to our program. Avril actually was introduced to art on her first museum visit at LACMA. There she saw a portrait of Rembrandt's Titus, as well as Ed Ruscha's actual size. And she encountered a docent, and perhaps that helped her coalesce her future. She trained as a docent at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 2010. She also is an active docent at the Oakland Museum of California. And she has an active teaching schedule at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, as well as Diablo Valley College. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Avril. Avril, please, there you go.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, Karen and Marcia. Let me see, I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. Let me bring up just use that up there. Great. So thank you so much for coming tonight to hear about the painter of laughter and life, Frans Hals. Now, if you're of a certain age, the term Dutch masters calls to mind a distinctive box in which you kept shells, buttons, and other childhood treasures. Now, you might well have been intrigued by the painting on the box, an unusual group portrait of some dour-looking men in black. Now, this kind of group portrait, which we really don't see much of elsewhere in the Western art tradition, was one of a number of art genres developed in the Netherlands in the 17th century during the country's golden age by the painters who have come to be called the Dutch masters. Now, Rembrandt, whose image of the syndics or the board of trustees of the Drapers Guild is on the box, our useful box, Rembrandt was the top dog, but barking right behind him was the subject of tonight's talk and of an extensive exhibition at Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, which just closed in early June, and he is Frans Hals. Now, even his official website concedes that Hals lacks the psychological insight of Rembrandt. His works, however, are full of spirit and let us see, well, happiness in his sitters. Hals was the master of the smile, unusual in the portraits of his era, not because people were more somber in those long ago days necessarily, but simply because a smile is hard to paint. Hals shows us people in relaxed moments, often with a drink in their hand, and focuses on capturing a fleeting instant. His works are full of movement, even when depicting 10 or 12 people sitting down. He is notable for his loose, painterly brushwork which was applied in layers, not all at once, as it might seem. And this less formal style has influenced many artists, right down to the French Impressionists. Through his work, we can discover much about life in a unique cultural moment when this tiny country, the Netherlands, which is sometimes underwater, was a crossroads of culture, was a world economic power, was dominant in science and technology, and was home to a roster of delightful artists specializing in newly defined genres. So in the 16th century, what we today call the Netherlands and what we today call Belgium were one unit, part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. So in this image, the northern Netherlands are in color, but you can see the bottom that's outlined in blue. That's the lower part of the Netherlands, Belgium, basically. And by the way, the Habsburgs are in green. They were all over Europe, all over the place. By the end of the century, though, the North began a century-long struggle to get out of the empire and establish a Protestant republic. Immigration into this more tolerant region by Calvinist dissenters from Antwerp in the southern Netherlands and elsewhere in the south, many of these emigres were skilled craftsmen like this mast maker, and this became an important source of strength and wealth. Soon, Amsterdam overtook Antwerp as the economic engine of the combined Netherlands. As an example, Amsterdam went from having 3 sugar refining plants in 1605 to having about 50 by 1662. Seafaring wealth, which includes what we now call colonial plunder, accumulates in what's now called the United Provinces, the northern Netherlands. At this time, this was 1/3 the size of England. So this wealth accumulates at an extraordinary rate during the 17th century, and with it, an entirely new class was born, the bourgeoisie. No better illustration of these people than in the works of the third great Dutch master, Johannes Vermeer. This painting, by the way, is fun to see because it's one of the ones that was lost in the Gardner Museum heist way back when that was. Now, unlike Venice, which was another seafaring power based on trade, Amsterdam was not ruled by aristocrats, but by Protestant businessmen and investors more interested in profit than in glory. And the Dutch were so interested in their new bourgeois society that they devised entirely original types of painting to celebrate it. So without the patronage of the Catholic Church, artists in the northern Netherlands relied on the market so that Dutch people, Amsterdammers of even modest income, were able to buy paintings that depicted the physical world around them with astonishing fidelity. The market encouraged many artists to specialize in the new genres, such as still life. This is actually a subspecialty called a breakfast painting. You'd like to have a painting of your own breakfast, I'm sure, in the home, but if it looked like this, you probably would. Flower paintings, of course, became a specialty. Paintings of churches, that was a specialty, and you'll notice they're very, very bare inside, no paintings in there. And genre paintings of carousing and hijinks, usually by a group of rowdy peasants. And finally, the specialty of Frans Hals, the upscale group portrait. Now, Frans Hals was born in 1580 or 1581 in Antwerp. He was the son of a weaver, and his family joined the brain drain after the Spanish invasion of Antwerp. They emigrated to Haarlem in the north, where he lived the rest of his life. In Haarlem, young Frans was trained by a painter named Karel van Mander, who was another immigrant from Antwerp. By 1610, he had joined the Haarlem Painters Guild and became an independent artist with his own apprentices and assistants. In the same year, he married Anneke Harmens, the daughter of a Haarlem linen bleacher. They had 3 children together before Harmens died in 1615, so very quickly later. Hals remarried 2 years later, and he and his second wife, Lisbeth Reniers, had another 11 children. Hals was by all accounts a successful artist who completed some 600 canvases in his career. He did certainly frequent local taverns where he no doubt met the civic worthies whose portraits formed such a large part of his income. But his reputation as a boisterous carouser, this is a self-portrait, this reputation comes from a biography by one Arnold Houbraken, who was born 6 years before Hals's death, so he was not a contemporary of him. And the work is largely based on secondhand reports. Interestingly, there was actually another man named Frans Hals in Haarlem. He was charged with spousal abuse, and for many years, the painter was assumed to have committed this offense until an eagle-eyed art historian pointed out that the incident took place when the painter was unmarried. So perhaps the rowdy drinker of all the stories was this other Frans Hals. Who knows? But Frans Hals, the painter, here's one of his earliest works, the portrait of Jacobus Zaphius, who was a Catholic archbishop in Haarlem. This is an example of the tolerance of the North. It was a Protestant republic, but he was allowed to apply his trade as a Catholic archbishop. Authenticity of this work was once disputed, since it doesn't show the kind of breathy brushwork that we associate with Hals, but it's a very early work, and that style developed over the years. He was just beginning, but he has caught the archdeacon with a slight smile or something unusual going on with his mouth there, which is something that we see frequently in Hals. And this early portrait of a woman, unidentified, shows a more finished style again than what we expect of Hals, but her unusual stance, her hands open, possibly holding the chain that she's wearing, is one of the ways that Hals typically injects some movement into a very static work. Now, although Hals' work was in demand throughout his life, he did experience financial difficulties. In addition to painting, he worked as an art dealer and a restorer, as Johannes Vermeer also did. His creditors, Hals' creditors, took him to court several times, and to settle his debt with a baker in 1652, he sold his belongings, that is to say, 3 mattresses and bolsters, an armoire, a table, and 5 pictures. Left destitute, the municipality gave him an annuity of 200 florins in 1664. Rembrandt and Vermeer, interestingly, were similarly destitute by the ends of their lives. Hals died in Haarlem in 1666 and was buried in the St. Bavo church there. His wife outlived him and spent her last years in an almshouse. Now, it's unlikely that Hals ever painted landscapes, still lifes, or narrative pieces. His specialty and his commercial niche was the portrait. He produced them in 3/4 length, full length, with 1 sitter, 2 sitters, group portraits, family portraits of Haarlem's high and mighty, and also of simple folk, and of course, of the civic groups. So let's look at some of them, starting with the upper crust, the wearers of millstone ruffs, lace, and brocade. Here is Paulus von Beresteyn, a local lawyer. He looks like a sharp customer. I wouldn't really want to go up against him in court. Hals has paid as much painterly attention to his hands as to his face. And of course, you know that the hands and the face are the most difficult aspects of a person to paint. And often when there are apprentices in the studio, they do other things and the master does the hands and the face. But I love his hands here. Now, floating above him in the air is his coat of arms, and the work is inscribed at age 40. This is often on portraits of this sort. Now, in this portrait of the local beadle, not a beadle, not John, Paul, George, and Ringo beadle. A beadle is an official in the church, named Peter Cornelisson van der Morsch. Hals uses some accessories here to give us a lot of information about his life and personality. So Morsch here was a member of what was called a originator society. These were groups of socially minded amateurs who put on plays and poetry competitions in the Netherlands. Most Dutch towns would have one or two of them. Hals was a member of one himself. Now, in this portrait, Van der Morsch is holding a smoked herring, and it's red. It's a red herring. He's holding a smoked herring in his hand. The basket below his other hand holds some other of them. Now, this has to do with his, not just his personality, but the persona he adopted in the society. In current parlance, a red herring, to give somebody a red herring was to talk sarcastically about them. So he did that. This plus his slogan there, Wie begeert, which means who wants some. This would be something that he said, like Steve Martin says, I'm a wild and crazy guy. So that was like his slogan. And even up above at the top where his coat of arms is present, let me see if I can use my magic magnifying glass and show you that. There's, wait, can that go away? Can I move it? Yeah, okay. I don't know if you can see. See, there's a monkey, like a little monkey holding up his coat of arms, which shows half of a silver unicorn. So, and this in Latin says his age is 73 in 16, what is that, 16, I guess? Yeah. So a lot of cool information about him in this wonderful portrait. So all of this refers to his sharp wit, of course. And here's Isaac Massa, a frequent subject of Frans Hals, in this telling stance, which we now, of course, associate with power, confidence, and performance. We see it all the time. Goes all the way back to the 17th century. But I think Massa here has a sort of a judgmental kind of look going on with this. And notice the wonderful hat he's wearing. Here, of course, is the famous Laughing Cavalier, who is 26 years old in this portrait. It's, I think in works of this sort, it can be very difficult to judge someone's age because 26-year-olds for us are not anywhere near as formal as this generally. This is a really interesting portrait, and oddly, it's not known who the sitter is, but he is in the extreme foreground of this work. He's almost life-sized and seen kind of a little bit from below, which all contributes to making him impressive. He's also clearly dressed to impress. Now, he's not laughing, of course, just favoring us with perhaps the second most enigmatic smile in Western art. The title is a Victorian invention. We came up with that. The sitter, unknown, is probably a member of one of the civic militias that Hals documented in so many group portraits. He is dressed totally fitted in brand new French menswear. Generally, people at this time, and at this time, were still wearing tighter fitting black costumes that came from the Spanish court. Remember, they were ruled by the Spaniards for many years, and that was still popular. Black was expensive, it was hard to create. So generally the clothes would be all black, but this is running riot with embroidery. The sleeve slashes were a recent French innovation, allowing the white linen shirt to peep out from underneath. And the unbelievable embroidery on his very prominent sleeves is impeccably painted. So let me use the, yeah, here we can see, on one hand, you can see the sash is got kind of rough painting, but Hals, who is known for his sketchy, brushy style, is also able to create incredibly detailed images of lace and of this embroidery. The embroidery has a super number of emblems in it. Some of them signify the pleasures and pains of love. That would be the bees, the arrows, the flaming cornucopia, lovers' knots, and tongues of fire. Other things that you might find on there, there are obelisks and pyramids, which signify strength. And there's a Mercury's cap, which symbolizes fortune, which I think is appropriate for this guy. Now, his soft collar here, put this back down, was also an innovation in the 1620s. So it's not the millstone rough. And it's made of layers and layers and layers of linen trimmed with bobbin lace. And just under the crook of his arm is visible the top of a sword, a rapier. This was also de rigueur for the well-dressed Dutchman at the time, as necessary as a hat. And this sword was probably English. So he's a really cool character. Now, did I mention that in the 17th century, the Netherlands was a republic run by sober businessmen? Yes, nevertheless, we have someone like this. The portrait of Willem Heithausen was a cloth merchant who clearly has visions of aristocratic grandeur. This portrait really captures some of the paradoxes of those times. It was not just Protestant, it was Calvinistic, and yet we have these fantastic costumes going on. We have the genre paintings of carousing and drinking and so forth, all kinds of paradoxes in this culture. This man, who looks like he's a character out of a Rubens or Van Dyck or a British aristocrat, actually founded two hofjes, which were essentially poorhouses. It was a series of small houses built around a courtyard. That was the hof. They were designed to house the elderly poor, often women. So these people were impressed with the need to be sort of socially responsible. And so somebody who looks like this would found a couple of hofjes. He stipulated in his will that his hofjes be maintained from the proceeds of the sale of his estate. And one of the hofjes is still in operation in Haarlem, now lived in probably by students. This elegant aspirational painting was once assumed to have been half of a wedding set, but if it were, he would be facing left, not right. Plus, it's known that his fiancée died before the marriage could actually take place. Hals painted this guy 3 times. It's another interesting character with quite a lot to say in that face there. This is Jasper Schade van Westrum. He was a representative to the States General, to the Congress, basically. Best known today for this portrait. Research has revealed that it was actually painted alla prima, or what they call wet in wet, which is unusual for Hals. And it's small, it's only sort of 25 by 30 inches. So it could have been completed while Schade was on a day trip to Haarlem, taking it with him home, still wet. So this beautiful shot silk jacket is absolutely lovely. And notice by 1645 that the big millstone rough collar has gone the way of bell-bottom pants, although this collar is still of starched linen and is probably very uncomfortable to wear, probably scratchy. Now, as is the case with some species of birds, Hals's male sitters generally display more elaborate finery than the women do, although we can certainly find some exceptions. Could anyone be better fitted than 3-year-old Katharina Hooft here with her nurse? The silver rattle she's being amused with is, of course, a status symbol. This young girl came of a prominent family and became herself a celebrated personality after marrying the mayor of Amsterdam when she was only 16. Hard to believe you would put a child in an outfit like this, or being in an outfit like this, the child can still smile as she's doing. This woman, Isabella Koymans, she is also beautifully turned out and is coyly looking left towards her husband in this wonderful wedding pair. So this was a frequent type of portrait that was done not just by Hals, but by others, of 2 people celebrating their marriage. There is no adequate explanation for why we see only half the rose that Isabella is holding out to her husband, Stephanus, that looks like he's reaching over to take hold of it. I don't know why it's that way. But speaking of wedding portraits, this is one of my absolute favorites of Hals, but of anybody. I absolutely love the wedding portrait of Isaac Massa and Beatrix von der Laan. This is a gorgeous thing that really shows, I think, Hals at his best, with the attitude of these two people whom we don't expect, I don't think, to be looking as kind of coy as they are in these dark costumes and so forth. So as a wedding portrait, she's not in white. White was not necessarily a bridal costume until much later. People got married however they wanted to. And in fact, they could get married just by saying so. They didn't actually have to be consecrated in a church or anything like that. But this is a great portrait of a man and a woman who are separated by 24 years. He's much, much older than she is here. And we see them outdoors in a rather fake environment, the oak tree behind them with either ivy. I've read different places that it's ivy or that it's a grapevine twined around the tree, which of course is a symbol of the young person being supported by the strong older one. So a lot of what we see in a work like this is symbolic of marriage and concerns of marriage. Down in the front, we see a thistle there that tells us that has to do with tough things that happen, prickly things that happen in life, like work. So it's not all pleasure. We have to work too. And behind them, we see this kind of love garden, which is not at all typical of the Netherlands. In those days, there weren't fountains in the Netherlands because they didn't have pumps. To have a fountain, you had to have a reservoir of some sort up a little higher so that the water could run down to it. And you just don't have that, especially not in Haarlem. So this is a fantastic kind of classical looking background called a love garden, which is helping to, present the theme here, the wedding theme. But I think what is most interesting about it is the circle that their hands make. If you look at where the white highlights are of Beatrix's hand and her cuff, and then his hand in a glove, then there's the white collar, then her big ruff that was probably made of something like 100 feet of linen, folded, and stitched together. This was not something that you would wear every day. It's a real specialty outfit. They're kind of in their Sunday best here. But this lovely circle that they make together, that's just a wonderful and charming portrait, I think. Isaac Massa, the man here, had made his fortune as a silk merchant in Russia, and he was a noted expert on the country. Hals painted him 2 more times, and the painting of him on the left there from 1626, that is probably, this is unusual to have a window in a Hals painting, but that the pine trees out the window are presumably a reference to Russia. And in his hand, the sprig of holly, I think it is, represents friendship and constancy, either the friendship between Massa and Hals, or perhaps constancy, that he is going to stay faithful to his wife on his long trips to Russia and so forth, his long absences. And the other painting from 1660, the same guy later in life, and between these two, you can see how Hals's style changes over time. It becomes much brushier, much sketchier, and darker too. But Hals, though, didn't spend all his time courting the wealthy. He made many portraits of plain people, ordinary people. Often he liked to do musicians and actors, people like Mr. Peckelherring, or Pickled Herring, who was a stock character in 17th century comic plays. Mr. Pickelherring is a gluttonous buffoon whose diet of herring gives him, of course, an insatiable thirst. So you can imagine all the situations he can get in. And there he is holding a tankard of some sort in his hand. Very typical Hals, sketchy, brushy, the smile and so forth, very casual kind of picture. He also did numerous portraits of children. Look at these kids with their goat cart there. Okay, this is interesting. There seems to be half of a head in the upper right. This gave researchers a clue that this is part of one of the 4 known family groups he did. The left half is in the collection of the Toledo Museum of Art, with an extra baby in the lower left added by someone later on. The center half there is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, Belgium. And a third fragment that you see up at the top is in a European private collection. So these make up the 3 surviving pieces of the original portrait. This was, 3 of them were displayed together in the Toledo Museum of Art in 2018. And this is a reconstruction of what the whole thing must have looked like, quite a family, as you can see. And that solves the problem of what the half head up at the top is looking like. Do love the goat. Now, Hals also did many tronies. So a trony is I don't know if it's unique, this is certainly a Dutch tradition, a kind of a sample painting presenting a type of person rather than a specific individual, although, of course, individuals did sit for them. They were ways for the artist to try out different costumes, different expressions, different ethnicities, things like that. And tronies were very popular, inexpensive, and people bought them. In fact, the most famous painting of the 17th century, this one, is a trony. It is a tryout of a girl with an exotic kind of turban on her head. And Rembrandt also did a lot of tronies using himself as a model. And so he tries out these weird expressions to see what he can do. So for Hals, the merry drinker here is also known as military officer holding a Birkmeyer. This is probably a trony. The sitter is unknown, but images of militiamen like this drinking, or at least raising their glasses and gesturing vigorously, these were pretty popular in Haarlem at the time. This gypsy girl, La Bohemienne, is also a trony, a study of a facial expression and an unusual costume rather than any kind of commissioned portrait. This, by the way, is the first work of Frans Hals to enter the Louvre. Now, you'll notice here she's got quite a display of cleavage that we have not seen before in Hals, and indeed this was not common in Hals's time and place. For this reason, art historians have assumed that this is supposed to be the painting of a sex worker, nor was there any reason to assume that the model was Romani, was a gypsy of any sort. That also is a 19th century name that was attached to it. There's a couple more tronies of fishers. These are interesting in that they're outside. And he's clearly, with young subjects like this, he can just do whatever he wants, try things out. He doesn't have to please anyone. He's a really charming, laughing boy. Remember those 50 sugar factories I told you about in Amsterdam? That's may account for his teeth here and this wild hair and everything. It's just a lovely little work. These are possibly tronies also, just singers, boy with a viol or with a lute player and so forth, boys with instruments. And then we have this charming work, a rommelpot. So he's holding a rommelpot. And as you can see, these children are surrounding him and laughing. So this thing is a pig's bladder stretched over an earthenware jug half filled with water. And there's a reed in it that, you move up and down to produce probably something like a whoopee cushion would be my guess. I imagine that's what it sounded like, and children would love that. This would be played by impoverished street musicians. Particularly, they were associated with sort of Mardi Gras time, the pre-Lenten celebrations. And you can see that this is so because the man is wearing a foxtail on his hat, which is also a symbol of the fool at the time. This Shrovetide, they call it, is the last round of merrymaking before the start of a somber Lenten season. And in Mala Baba, or Mad Baba, from 1640, we see a woman with a difficult kind of grin here, believed to be a local woman named Barbara Kleistdaughter, with an owl, which is in this period a symbol of folly, on one shoulder, and of course with her big tankard there. She is considered to be a local person, a real person, who was sent to a workhouse a few years later. And interestingly, 2 of Hals's 10 surviving children were sent to the same workhouse that Kleist's ended up in, a son for a mental issue and a daughter for promiscuity. But Hals's genius for spontaneity within a carefully constructed armature shines best in his 9 group portraits. Now, in the Netherlands, civic participation allowed citizens to attain the stature and renown that aristocrats had elsewhere in Europe. So we find them endowing hofjes, orphanages, and so forth, and serving in these civil militias. Remember that the country was at war for almost 80 years. And in the early days, these National Guards did serve a military function, protecting the city or the town from attack, or if there was a revolt or a fire or something like that, and those were frequent. The group portraits that Hals and others did were hung in the militia's meeting halls, often high on the wall, which sometimes explains certain perspective decisions. By the later part of the century, such groups were entirely ceremonial, and as Hals's works show us, these guys did a lot of eating and drinking. Hals himself, as a loyal citizen of Haarlem, served in the Sint Jorisdoelen civil militia from 1612. And Rembrandt's Night Watch, as you may know, is also the portrait of one of these civil militias. So here we go. Here's the St. George, or Sint Jorisdoelen, from 1616. This was a tough commission, and one of his first. He was asked to paint the group that he actually had been himself a member of. This would celebrate the end of their 3-year term of service. In a work like this, each man paid his share, so each person had to be clearly and appropriately represented. And in fact, a painter could live for a year or so on a commission like this with this many characters in it. Hals must have thought quite a bit about the politics of the group before even starting out. He relied on an image of the same group from 1599, but OMG, what a difference. So this is like 20 years or so earlier. For a start, so we can look at these men, they all look related. I mean, you can actually see everybody's face clearly. There's, that's fine. But they look like they're all cousins or something, great similarity between them. There's very little sense of space, very claustrophobic, right? So here's what Hals did. In the first place, this is a meter wider, and this thing is huge. It's about 6 feet by 10. And this is done on a giant piece of linen. The previous one was on wood. And there's a wonderful illusion of space. The men don't fill up the top of the painting. There's an illusion of space, window to the outside, darkness back there. And this is also created or stressed by the diagonals, which lead out the window. Now, this may look like a casual grouping, but it's not. They're in strict accord with military protocol. So the highest ranking officer is at the head of the table over there with the orange sash. At his right is the provost, the second ranking officer. 3 captains and lieutenants are at the lower end of the table. The 3 ensigns, who were not actually members of the officer corps, they and the servant back there stand up. In the foreground, in front of the table, are Captain Nicholas Wouterson van der Meer and Lieutenant Peter Adriaanson Verbeek, both of whom had served as mayor of Haarlem. And the flag that they're holding there, that's the flag of Spain. So that's a real prize. So here we can see Hals, I think, at his best, these superb portraits, but it's also an effective still life painting. We've got a brocade tablecloth and cushions and so forth that are embroidered, the dishes and everything on the table that they're eating from, and the landscape even out the window. This work was indeed well received, and Hals received commissions from several of the members, and he painted the group again in 1627 and 1639. Here's the 1627 version, again celebrating the end of this group's 3-year tenure. Now, in this one, the sense of interaction between the characters is heightened. Some are even looking out of the picture. If you notice where people are facing, they do look, many of them, like they're talking to each other, looking out, talking to us. But the hierarchical arrangement is as important as in the first one. The guy looking backwards over the chair is in the central, in the front of the painting is the central figure, Captain Michael de Waal. Now, just as a comparison, here is one of Rembrandt's first important group works, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp from the same year. Rembrandt is like 25 years or so younger than Frans Hals, so he's kind of starting out here. But you can see that as wonderful as this painting is, it doesn't have anywhere near the liveliness that Hals's does. Now, there's another one, 1633. This is the St. Adrian Company. These are riflemen, while the St. George Guild were archers and crossbowmen, right? So these are in 1633. Now the men are seated outside in the courtyard, probably because a number of them are holding their weapons, their rifles. This very horizontal composition is somewhat more subdued than in the 1627 St. George, and fewer of the men seem to be really interacting here. Somebody's reading a book over on the right side. There is certainly interaction, but less perhaps, but we have that wonderful sash on the back of the central character with his great hat going on there. Now, commission for a civic guard portrait like this was rarely granted to a painter from outside the city. And it's worth noting that in the 17th century in the Netherlands, small as it is, different towns all had a slightly different style. They all had really well-known painters, and they had kind of a different style that was known in that town. So you would, if you had a civic guard, there would be somebody in town who was capable of painting it. And so it usually was somebody from town, but quite exceptionally, Frans Hals was asked to paint this Amsterdam group. However, he found himself at odds and with a beef of some sort with these guys. And an Amsterdam painter named Peter Cod had to step in to finish the 7 figures on the right. Cod was somebody who was known for his small scale, smooth and finely executed works. He was what they call a fine painter, which Hals was not, but he nevertheless did his best to imitate Hals's loose style the best he could. Now, Hals was fond of daylight and a silvery sheen, and although he was familiar with Caravaggio, he avoided the artificial contrasts of low light and dark gloom that we see more frequently in Rembrandt. Hals maintained contacts with his hometown of Antwerp, and he visited there in 1616, where he would have seen the work of Anthony van Dyck and Peter Paul Rubens, whose works, there they are, were much looser and sketchier than what was typical in the North. And of course, they're dealing with aristocrats, as you can see. Hals began his paintings with a rough sketch using gray contours, which would serve as the foundation for his building up of layers of paint. He rarely, as I said, painted alla prima or all at once. That was considered a real challenge because if you paint that way, any mistakes had permanent consequences. Later, modern painters accepted mistakes of that sort as what they call pentimenti, or signs of spontaneity. But Hall's style changed throughout his life. As I said, paintings of vivid color were gradually replaced by pieces where one color dominated. After 1641, he showed a tendency to restrict his palette and to suggest color rather than express it. Darker tones, even with much black, really took over. Now, his restricted palette is particularly noticeable in his flesh tints, which from year to year become grayer until finally the shadows are painted in almost absolute black. This coincides with a period of poverty, so some historians have suggested that he used black and white pigment because it was cheap. But it could also have to do with the sober dress and the sober demeanor of his subjects, and perhaps a general sobering of his attitude as he grew older. Now, his group portraits aren't restricted to the military. He also documented these boards of trustees, such as Rembrandt did in his Syndics of the Drapers Guild. Notable in the Netherlands in this era were almshouses, I said, or hofjes, and hospitals for the poor, orphanages, and so forth. Rich people from the upper classes who had no heirs would, while they were still alive, bequeath their capital to the construction of a hofje, where poor elderly people, usually women, could live for free. Most of the hofjes are named after their founders, and many of them still exist. So here, for example, are the regents of the St. Elizabeth Hospital of Haarlem. Now, in these later works, where the brushstrokes are even looser, he's focusing on creating an overall impression rather than telling detail. Where his earlier pieces radiated gaiety and liveliness, his later portraits emphasized the stature and dignity of the people portrayed. So in this painting, the man on the right with the money in front of him is the treasurer, and the map hanging on the wall probably alludes to one of the duties of the trustees of the hospital, which is to manage the land that the hospital owned. Here are the regentesses, the female regents of the old man's house, the Oude house, from 1664. The date is not entirely certain on this, but for sure we can tell that the women's dress places the portrait well past the 1640s when they had the millstone collars. These are much simpler collars. Hals was in his 80s when this was done, beyond caring perhaps to flatter these austere sitters. This painting and a companion painting of the male regents of the old man's house currently hangs in what was the old man's almshouse in Haarlem, which is today the Frans Hals Museum. There it is. Now, over the course of the 18th century, Hals's work gradually fell into obscurity, although he was still well enough known that many paintings, for example, of Judith Leyster, a student of Hals's and one of the first woman members of the Haarlem Artists Guild, were generally considered to be by Frans Hals. And you can see in this portrait, self-portrait, particularly in the work she's painting, that she has a similar approach to Hals, but then that was the Haarlem style of painting. This error wasn't rectified until the 19th century, that a French art critic noticed that, they cleaned the painting, they noticed a different signature, that someone had put Hals's signature on a work like this one over Leyster's. Whether she did it, somebody did it later, probably it made the painting more valuable. But Leyster has now been discovered and is revered as an important painter in the 17th century. She actually, it's recorded that she sued Hals at one point for poaching an apprentice from her. She had her own apprentices and stuff. But in any case, in the late 19th century, art historians rectified that mistake and also focused new attention on Hals and on Vermeer for that matter. The art critic observed, even the slightest painting by him, by Hals, is attractive and offers a lesson to artists. All aspects of his work are instructive, his faults as well as his strengths, for his faults are always those of a great practitioner. Now, while Hals may have been the bronze medalist in the Dutch 17th century after Rembrandt and Vermeer, he was golden in the 19th. The Impressionists, especially, were impressed by Hals's spontaneity and dash. He was called the Manet of his day, or perhaps Manet was the Hals of his day. The similarity. Many 19th century painters visited Haarlem and studied and copied Hals's paintings. There, for example, is a copy of Baba Baba by Gustave Courbet. John Singer Sargent, for example, advised a friend of his to visit the city and to begin with Frans Hals, copy and study Frans Hals. After that, go to Madrid and copy Velasquez, but leave Velasquez till you have got all you can out of Frans Hals. Sargent made many copies after Hals and would keep them for the rest of his life. In fact, in this photograph taken in his studio a few years after his visit to Haarlem, you can see kind of not in the center, on the right side, up high on the wall, that is a Sargent's copy of the two rightmost women in the regentesses of the old man's house. Those strange later in life works of Hals's were a particular favorite of these 19th century painters. Here, for example, are the regentesses painted by Edouard Manet. And the painting, the paired painting of the male regents, which is one of his strangest works, as I think you can see. Notice that the man standing highest up is a servant, and he's wearing a very old-fashioned collar. He's not in the height of fashion. That was old stuff in the 1660s. But the man in front of him has a very unusual expression, which has variously been attributed to a decline in Hals's skills, or the fact that the man was possibly drunk, or perhaps he had had a stroke or something like that. Very unusual. Nevertheless, this painting was noted approvingly by Vincent van Gogh, who copied the drooping hands of the rightmost figure in his portrait of the postman, what's his name? Joseph Roulin, right? There's the Van Gogh. There are the hands of Frans Hals. Vincent spoke admiringly of Hals's 27 blacks, he said, and said, never did he paint Christ's Annunciation to shepherds, angels or crucifixions or resurrections. Never did he paint voluptuous and bestial naked women. According to Vincent van Gogh, Hals painted portraits. Nothing but that. And in his wonderful way of doing so, a 20th century painter, Lucien Freud, said Hals was fated always to look modern. So thank you very much. If anybody has any comments or questions, Marcia, that we could talk about, that would be great.
There are several comments here, Avril.
Okay.
First of all, I need to apologize. I believe I mispronounced your last name. Angevin, is that?
Angevine, yes.
Angevine, all right.
You mispronounced.
Okay, thank you. Mary Lou Cross, there we go. It's a fascinating study of an artist she did not know. And other comments about this is excellent, so knowledgeable. Lena actually had a couple of comments about, one was the lace work. She really felt it was absolutely magnificent. And it certainly, and it really showed a different side of Frans Hals that I was used to seeing. And then she also made a comment, and I'm not sure, she did not indicate what painting she's talking about, but it was right before, I believe, the Katerina, the little girl with her nursemaid, right? The Katerina, and she said she was really surprised by the impressionistic brushstrokes that we see in the jacket.
Yep.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions also, and there'll be other questions coming in and other notes of appreciation. Just wondering, you mentioned his students and you mentioned Judith Leister. I'm wondering if there's anybody else that we might recognize.
Mm, um, Probably not. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of painters in the 17th century that if you take a class, you learn about them. But as far as really well-known people, I don't think so necessarily. She is probably, I don't think there's something about costumes there. Um, she is maybe one of the better known ones. And of course, she was not better known until recently, right? She
Yes.
was, is now considered, an important painter.
Question about the costumes. Were they made specifically for the portrait sittings? Let's go further. Were they owned by the individuals who were shown in the portraits? Were they props owned by Frans Hals?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You probably know that both Vermeer and particularly Rembrandt had lots of costumes that they collected that they could use as props in paintings. And certainly Rembrandt would be painting biblical subjects or mythology, so he needed a lot of costumes in that way. And in the tronies that they painted, they could dress somebody up in a costume and have them, say, look like a gypsy or whatever. But I think in portraits of people, those would be their clothes, their outfits, because they're dressed to impress, they're styling, they're bringing out their good stuff. I believe they would be the costumes of the individuals who are depicted for sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And actually mentioning the tronies, I'm just curious. There was one that was in a circular format, and I'm just wondering, was that possibly part of an architectural setting? A circular format is an unusual thing to see.
Yeah, Sue, you spell it Tronie, is Trony. That circular painting called, it's called a tondo, I guess, and it might have been in some yeah, I don't know why he would do that. And he has some that are like in a diamond shape, so I guess just change it up a little bit. Because those were not done for people. He could do what he liked, and then, people would buy them if they liked them, but he was not, I mean, this is, people in this period who were and later who were working for clients. It's like an interior decorator, right? You got to please the client, not yourself necessarily. So maybe you keep your little quirks and kind of tryouts until later when you're not being paid.
Right. And just, do you know anything about his working methodology as far as his studio practices?
Not really. As I said, he didn't work wet on wet, and he didn't work, I mean, especially the sketchy ones. It looks like, oh, you just went and did it. No, they were done in layers. He started out with a gray sketch and built up from there. How long it would take to do some of these, I don't know, a while. And certainly the big group portraits would take a long time. He probably had to have guys come in individually and sit for their portrait and so forth. Which brings up another question about the way he can paint a smile, because you cannot pose with your mouth open. I mean, that's one of the reasons you see it so rarely. So I don't know exactly how he did that. He did not have the very first camera, that I'm certain of.
Well, the accolades just continue to come in. Thank you so much. And we very much appreciate the presentation. It was fascinating as always. Um, and I'm going to suggest people actually look on the website for the Fine Arts Museums, because you're doing a presentations for the American Decorative Arts Forum as well.
In the fall, yes. Yeah.
Right. And uh,
That's on tiles, California tiles in architecture. So like split brain, totally different. We have some weird pockets of interest, strange interest. Anyway,
well, I want to thank everybody for attending the event, and many thanks to Avril as well for such an enlightening presentation. Of course, we have other outstanding upcoming Friends at Home program. I'm going to specifically highlight the July 31st author talk, Kelly Muskian, who is the author of Girls in a Stilt House. It was called A Remarkable Debut, and tells the story of Ada and Matilda, two young women who grew up in 1920s Mississippi. It has all of the secrets that are being hidden and just waiting to be exposed in a small town. It should be a real treat to hear the authors speak about that. Also remind you to please consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. Again, website is alamedafriends.com. Of course, this will allow us to continue sponsoring events such as this one this evening. And of course, watch the website, the newsletter, and the Facebook page for additional events and your opportunity to register. I want to thank those individuals who made this evening possible. Kumar Fonzie, who actually arranges for the docents to be on hand for us, Karen Manuel, and Beth Curarte, who did the backstage part of this and made it all happen. So finally, I want to thank all of you for being here this evening and joining us, and we hope you'll come back to see another program. Thanks so much.